Hello and welcome back to Digital Dialectics. I am Jonathan Herzog, and we are very pleased and lucky to have with us today Jason Yanowitz. Welcome, Jason.
Thanks for having me. Pleasure to be here.
Jason Yanowitz, by way of introduction, is co-founder of Blockworks Group, an events and media company that sits at the intersection of digital assets and traditional finance. Prior to Blockworks Group, Jason helped build the business development team at Scisense, a data analytics startup that raised nearly $300 million and worked in venture capital at Intuitive Venture Partners. We're very excited to have with us Jason Yanowitz, a widely regarded thought leader in cryptocurrency.
I don't know if I'd go that far, but it's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. Well, I want to first set up and kind of preface this moment. We're surrounded by us. You can hear now it's 7 p.m. in New York City in the 10th district, with this moment in time where more than 100,000 Americans have died from COVID, nearly twice the number that died in the Vietnam War. More than 40 million are unemployed. Tens of millions more have tried to file for unemployment. The Fed has said we'll be entering a new Great Depression. More than 1,000 people have been killed by police officers in the past year. Most recently, the murder, lynching of George Floyd in broad daylight on camera. And many other overlapping, intersecting crises in this moment. All the while, our federal legislature, Congress, has been on recess. The reason I thought it was so important to have someone like Jason on in this trying moment, in this trying time, is whenever we have such complexity, so much noise, so many overlapping crises on top of crises on top of crises. First off, it's really valuable to have uncorrelated or less correlated minds, ideas, and systems at place to try to make sense of what's going on around us. And second off, the crypto community is particularly critical in this juncture because our elected officials, our representatives, our public health officials, everyone from the World Health Organization to the Surgeon General, to the city health commissioner, to the mayor, we're asleep at the switch. And I'll just end this preface soon, but as late March, the New York City health commissioner was saying, ride the subway, ride the bus, face masks don't work, all is well. Boy, have things changed. And if you look at Jason's actually pinned tweet, he shared on this very fateful day on March 14th, an image, a glimpse of what life looked like in Italy and across the world. A sense of what was to come as nearly a million Americans are set to be wiped out over the next year. So this is the context, the very complicated, trying, tragic backdrop for this conversation. But I think it's of utmost importance to try to transcend and transform and move us to higher ground. So thank you, Jason.
Where should we begin?
Yes. So where to begin, really? I guess first off, would love to give you a moment and space to kind of start and reflect wherever you'd like before I kind of drive forward and start asking what I'd like to know. If there's anywhere you wanted to frame or start at the outset.
No, I mean, it might be helpful. All the folks listening didn't really come here to hear my background, but it might be helpful to give like a 30-second
absolutely
high level. I'm one of the co-founders of Blockworks Group. We're a media company in New York City. A lot of the folks who are watching this are into the political space. I come from a very political background. My grandfather was a U.S. senator, Howard Metzenbaum, if anyone's familiar with the old school kind of Democratic senators and politicians. I fell deep down the kind of Bitcoin rabbit hole when I was living in Hungary, actually, about 5 years ago. kind of put it aside for a few years, worked in venture capital, worked in tech, and then launched Blockworks Group, which is a media company, in May of 2018. So just came up on 2 years of running the company. We have 20 podcasts reaching about 2 million listeners a month. And really what we're trying to do is break down these complex topics related to finance for individuals who may not have the resources or may not know where to look or just really don't know where to begin. When things like the Fed pumping $3 trillion into the markets happen, where do you go to learn about that? Where do you go to learn about the potential of rampant inflation, about the potential of the market going up, but consumer goods not actually going up? So is that inflation? So where should I put my assets, right? There's nowhere that's really talking about that. And so we're looking to be that voice. And so I went to school down in Atlanta as well, at a school called Emory University, studied history down there. Very into what's happening with, been pretty tuned into coronavirus, as you mentioned with my tweet, and also pretty tuned into what's happening in America right now, because how could you not?
So there's actually some there I'd hope to kind of dive a little bit deeper in. So are your grandparents, were they immigrants to the country, or like what's your kind of generational?
Hungarian on one side, Polish on the other side. My grandparents were born here, born in Ohio, Cleveland, Ohio. Nice, last name's Yanowitz, and my mom's name is Metzenbaum. So you can figure out, nice Jewish family in Cleveland, Ohio, but pretty into the political space. Not so they were born here, but Hungarian on one side, Polish on the other.
Gotcha. And then so you said 5 years ago you had this kind of fateful moment or transition back in Hungary. Can you share a little bit more about that kind of awakening to your now kind of passion for Bitcoin and for crypto in particular?
Yeah, of course. So I was a history major in school, studied history and economics. I went to Hungary, Budapest, Hungary, for about 6 months to study Soviet Union economics and history. While I was out there, some students introduced me to Bitcoin. Basically thought it was magical internet money, really had no idea what it was really focused on Bitcoin from an investment lens, not from a political lens or a societal lens at all, really. I think it was about $300 at the time, and I was thinking, well, when's this going to go to $1,000, right?
How did that conversation go? So these kids come up to you and they're like, oh, there's this magical internet money. And you're like, okay, sounds great. Or like, was there like an evolution in your own education and belief in Bitcoin?
Yeah, I mean, the real story is I was into trading FX currencies, and so was pretty into just like the FX market, and so like the dollar and the yen and the pound and things like that. And actually what happened is they brought up Bitcoin as a potential alternative currency. I saw it as an investment vehicle. They actually, unlike me, saw it as a societal vehicle, and that's what really piqued my interest. And what happened was a lot of for anyone familiar with Hungary, which may be a lot, maybe not be a lot, but in recent years, it's fallen back into kind of this semi-communist regime, like just very tough politics out there. And
this is under Viktor Orban, is that right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, he's basically the guy who runs the country is buying up all the media stations. He owns about 90% of the media right now, and it's quite. He used the immigrant crisis, again, that's like his terminology, but like people coming in from kind of the Middle East into Hungary to basically, he used that as like a political weapon to shut down the country. But going full circle back to Bitcoin, a lot of the students, their parents lived under the communist regime, right? So when they take public transportation, they take the subways, they take the tram, they walk around. Their parents have taught them that be careful, right? Because they're listening to you. The government is listening to you. There are video cameras, there are microphones, right? And that's what their parents trained them to do, is understand that like this can happen. And that was the first time I ever saw that, right? Because like in the United States, our government works and our money works, and is there surveillance? Yes, but like, it doesn't seem like it's crazy here, right? But there is when I learned that like there was this whole 50-year period where like Soviet Union basically took over Eastern Europe, and what happened was the students saw Bitcoin as a way to get out of the system, as a way to govern their own money and take back control of their own money. And that's when it kind of triggered that spark for me.
Wow. I want to make sure, if you're open to this, we can kind of ground it a little bit more for folks who are tuning in or who will tune in, who even the word Bitcoin or a cryptocurrency or the idea of a decentralized digital currency might be a little bit foreign. So can you kind of just walk us through some of the foundations? And then that can help us unpack the allure in the context of a repressive authoritarian regime and restrictions on capital flow or what have you. But like, what's the fundamental basis of what we're even talking about?
It's a good question. It's a tough question, right? Because it can be explained. It really depends who's asking the question. So I say that Bitcoin is, in the United States, Bitcoin is the hardest country in the world to explain Bitcoin. Why? Because our government works and our money system works, our monetary system works, until maybe recently with the Fed pumping so much money into the markets. But point being, a lot of Americans and a lot of our friends don't understand Bitcoin because there's no use case, it seems like. Why? Because the government works and money works. But in other places, this idea of a non-manipulatable, a non-seizable, a non-censorable, a non-debasable money is really, really attractive. So let's go super high level though. Bitcoin was created by an anonymous person. He, she, them, a group of folks, someone called Satoshi Nakamoto, very early 2009. I think it was January 3rd, 2009. Bitcoin is something that can be described with hundreds of different definitions. A lot of people debate what they are, but to me personally, Bitcoin first and foremost is a new form of money, right? So let's zoom out beyond Bitcoin for a second. Let's think about the internet. The internet, when it came around, right, in the early 90s, 93, 94, it was just a new form of thinking about information, a new way of storing information, a new way of transferring information, a new way of just dealing, organizing, understanding information. And then there are all these second order effects that come out of that. Media companies, social media, things like that. Bitcoin, take the exact same sentence, but put in money. So Bitcoin is a new form of thinking, a new way of thinking about, instead of information like the internet, it's a new way of thinking about money, storing money, transferring money, dealing, organizing, just understanding money. And then there are all these second order financial effects that come from that. So that's how I think of Bitcoin.
And there's also some critical historical context, right? Where the sort of Genesis block and Satoshi's founding was in the wake of the financial crisis. So when the world economy collapsed in the wake of the mortgage-backed security crisis, we printed $4 trillion for the banks, and this was kind of baked into the idea behind the Internet of Money.
Yeah, I mean, so after 2008, right, the financial system starts to break. What happened was there was this second bank rescue package totaling about 50 billion euros that was announced by the British government. There were all sorts of quantitative easing around the world, in Japan, in the United States. But this one specifically was announced by the British government, right? It was about $50 billion or euros, or pounds, British government, as a response to the ongoing global financial crisis. What you're referring to, the Genesis block, every 10 minutes there's a block, like basically a new more Bitcoin is mined, and we can dive into that if you'd like to, or we can not go that deep down the rabbit hole. But basically, the first block said, the Times, January 3rd, 2009, Chancellor on the brink of second bailout for banks. Now, why is that interesting? Bitcoin grew out of a financial crisis. What we're seeing is 11 years later, it's getting a lot stronger during what looks like another massive financial crisis. And there was something just called the halving last month, and the halving block said New York Times. So the first one ever said, The Times, January 3rd, 2009, Chancellor on brink of second bailout for banks. This one said, New York Times, April 9th, 2020, with $2.3 trillion injection. The Fed's plans far exceed the 2008 rescue.
Now, again, this is critical context, because we're talking about just recently, over the past number of weeks, the past month, with the House. So Congress has been on recess, but they returned to session to pass the CARES Act. And what this stimulus bill did was, as Jason just said, inject $2.3 trillion for the large financial firms, essentially, and give a single $1,200 direct cash relief to people. So this was baked into the recent halving block.
Exactly, yeah.
Now, okay, so let's dive a little bit deeper. So Vitalik, who is founder of Ethereum, which is the second largest cryptocurrency, recently put out this tweet thread that got some attention on the comparison between 2008 and 2020. Again, so the kind of backdrop at the outset was financial crisis, global markets collapse. We need an alternative. We need a new internet of money that is decentralized, unable to be devalued or confiscated. Now, Vitalik argues, Jason, that in 2020, we're not talking just about financial crisis, or not just talking about financial censorship. We also need, he argues, decentralized governance and organization and community, and a restoration of public good outside of just a reform of money itself. So what do you make of his case that now 12 years later after the founding, the environment, the context is different?
It is different and it isn't different. I agree with him on some. I agree with him. So basically, so let's address what he's saying, and then I can respond to it. Basically, what he's saying is it's not just about the argument over the last several years is Bitcoin's a great investment, right? The reason that people and people talk about, when they talk about Bitcoin, they talk about it as being correlated with other assets. They talk about institutional investors are coming into the market. That is an interesting conversation for some people, but the reason we talk about that is because the folks who are building in the space, a lot of where the money is coming from, like the venture capital money and stuff like that, is in the United States. So remember, let's go back to the beginning of the conversation. The US, the US just thinks of Bitcoin as an investment because the government works and money works. What Vitalik is saying is elsewhere, for the last 11 years, Bitcoin has been a way to opt out of the traditional financial system, opt out of censorability, opt out of a currency that can be manipulated by the central bank, opt out of having the government track where your money's going, right? So I think what he's saying is that conversation just hit America, right? And I just wrote a piece on this. If anyone goes to our website, it's blockworksgroup.io, or you type in Blockworks Group on Google, about central bank digital currencies. And what's happening, and I think just to touch on the Vitalik thing one more time, is for the first time ever, Americans are seeing, we used to look at China and say, oh my God, so I feel so bad for Chinese citizens. There's so much censorship. They have no privacy, right? That would be terrible to work in. That would be terrible to live in China. Well, now, what's the difference between living in the States and living in China? I live in New York City. I mean, coincidentally, we're like, I think, a couple hundred feet away from each other in two separate apartment buildings right now, but we're both in Manhattan. The city shut down all ride-sharing services. You can't be out past 8 p.m. They shut down the bike services. A lot of subways are being guarded right now. They're limiting the ability for folks to demonstrate free speech. Now, it wouldn't be crazy and limiting our ability to go to things like protests. It wouldn't be crazy, right, because nothing's crazy, nothing's off the table anymore, to think that if you go to, and they're also surveilling who's going to these protests, right? So if I post something on Instagram or on Twitter and your face is in it at a protest, well, they're scanning those videos, right? So that's their surveillance side of things. So it wouldn't be crazy to just take it a little bit further and say that an announcement goes out, just like how we're all receiving these announcements on our phones to stay inside and that there's an 8 p.m. curfew. It wouldn't be crazy to think that your money, your monetary supply could be shut down if you attend a protest, right? So bring it full circle, what Vitalik's saying is, for the first time ever, for the entire global population, the ability to opt out of the system with a different form of money, a decentralized form of money, is becoming more interesting.
There is so much here. I went
on a little rant.
No, this is great. There are so many directions to take this. I want to try at every turn to ground it in as tangible, concrete examples as possible to really bring the kind of theory to life. One example I'll share, just personally, is in the context of this congressional campaign. Many months ago, I tried to open a campaign checkings account. So here I am trying to reverse engineer the process. We're in kind of the startup of politics. And so you Google it. You look at the FEC filings of the incumbent. You see the branch where they open their campaign checkings account, and you go there. Long story short, it took me weeks. I sat for hours and was stonewalled by Citibank, by Bank of America, by just to open a simple campaign checkings account. Ultimately found there's a non-for-profit bank called Amalgamated Bank where I could do just that. But it just illustrated what historically and empirically is the case, which is, if you look at the financial crisis as this nexus point, and particularly the disparate effect on communities of color when it comes to the housing market and redlining and lending practices of banks, the ability to discriminate or to selectively apply who has access to credit, who has access to capital, or to store it is a very, very powerful role that banking has provided. And so I think what you've been suggesting or kind of alluding to is how Bitcoin and the internet of money offers an alternative where, in theory, correct me if I'm wrong, but you can't discriminate as to whom has access to that capital.
Exactly. And now it's no different than and now Bitcoin's not the only thing where this is the case. There are other things, cash, right? Gold, right? But let's be real. Am I going to lug my gold? Not that I really own much gold, but am I going to lug my gold bars to the store? Or I want to buy a new phone. Am I going to take a gold bar? No. So gold's kind of out of the picture. Cash is great, right? However, there's an anti-cash movement that's been going on for about a decade, right? So it's a marketing thing, right? It's everyone from Visa to Amazon to the banks are putting massive amounts of money behind an anti-cash movement. And there's this anti-cash rhetoric and then coronavirus and COVID-19 only spurred this on further, right? Cash is dirty. People maybe saw that. There are supermarkets that won't take cash. What this is doing is pushing people into the web of financial services that are run by big tech, big financial services companies and financial institutions, and the government. Here's the problem, though. When something like coronavirus, no cash, meets something like a depression, and unemployment and things like that. The risks around COVID extend far beyond just the actual crisis and the actual virus. It's basically set in motion, as we all know, a major economic downturn, right? And what happens during an economic downturn is the banks are increasingly unstable, right? And so what they do is they pull back from giving services to people who are too risky. Who's too risky to a bank? That means they retract lending from small businesses. They ignore poorer people. They ignore poorer people who are seen as basically not as profitable to them as richer people. And what happens is if you are from a lower income neighborhood, like it's tougher to start a business. You can't get a loan from the bank. You run for politics and you can't even, like you were mentioning, open a bank account, right? And these are people who are oftentimes referred to as the unbanked or the underbanked. And these numbers increase drastically during a crisis. So we're kind of seeing everything to come together. No one's using cash anymore. You're basically locked into this system. There's a massive financial crisis going on. There's a massive global health pandemic. And yeah, so for all of these reasons, I'm pretty bullish on Bitcoin.
Now, so there are certain civil libertarian groups and advocates who would say, but Jason, we need to therefore stop this technological runaway problem, restore cash, and all will be well. Why should we have faith in the hands of big tech and the developers who can afford the computing power to mine Bitcoin?
You shouldn't have faith in big tech. We're also, I mean, we all understand, everyone watching this, we're not going to go back to a cash society, right? So then it becomes, and also I don't think we should. Like I like being able to pay for things online and like swipe my phone and stuff like that. The problem becomes when you're doing that is that there's someone on the other end tracking all of that. When I swipe my card, someone gets that data. Someone then sells that data. When I buy anything online, when I go to the grocery market, right? That's all being tracked and then that gets sold, right? So why should people trust big tech? They shouldn't trust big tech. Why should people trust Bitcoin? Well, because there's no one person behind this network, right? There are a lot of, we can get into how it works, but like there's a lot of people basically verifying these transactions. So
now, in the context of surveillance and the surveillance state and financial censorship, one thing that has been suggested in the American context is what we've seen is, if anything, chaos and more of a Huxleyan universe of hyper information density, where trying to discern the signal from the noise is what's impossible, as opposed to the kind of Eastern European Soviet experience of authoritarian, centralized governance and hyper repressive control. If anything, what you're seeing is the United States has failed to implement testing at any scale, failed to implement contact tracing at any scale. And the sort of historical context of the American ethos is sort of being built in opposite to royalty, right? Being built in opposite to authoritarianism. So are you more yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So let me back up for a second there, because I disagree with some things, but basically what you said about like the United States is kind of failed, right? In getting testing centers, innovating really quickly, right? And this is something that's really, really interesting. And it kind of makes you think, well, is America, what happened there, right? And the problem there is that there's something called, this guy, Matt Ridley. He wrote a book called The Rational Optimist. He's on the House of Lords in England. He's got this new book out that folks should read called How Innovation Works, Serendipity, Energy, and the Saving of Time. But he makes this argument that, and I think I agree with it, that the political structure of a country is actually less important than the regulatory structure when it comes to innovation. So again, the political structure of a country is less important than the regulatory structure when it comes to innovation. So let's take a look at the United States versus China. The US is a democratic political system, and a really heavy regulatory framework. China has a communist dictatorship and a light regulatory framework. So normally we'd think that the communist dictatorship is less innovative than the democratic nation. But that's the wrong comparison to make because you're looking at the political structure. What you should be looking at is the regulatory framework. And in this comparison, China is much further ahead of us and is able to get things up really, really quickly. And they've created an environment where entrepreneurs have more freedom. And I think that where we're moving is the nations that will succeed are the nations that have stateless innovation, where the innovation happens at the bottom and comes up through young entrepreneurs, people like yourself who are challenging the incumbents, as opposed to the state who are coming top down, right? And like Bitcoin is itself an example of stateless innovation. There would be zero politicians, zero governments who would have agreed to let their private citizens create a new currency, right? With the aspirations of assuming the position of the next global reserve currency. But because there's stateless innovation with it, it's been made possible. And this incredible technology that now has a market cap of $200 billion has come into existence.
I think this contrast with China is really critical, especially in this moment of both surveillance capitalism, but also surveillance authoritarianism. And I think an important framing is Yuval Harari's saying, which is whoever controls the algorithms is the government, where we have yet to offer a viable competitive alternative to state sanctioned, state centralized implementation of facial recognition, surveillance, tracking. We have yet to offer a liberal democratic alternative that is functional, that provides for sustained, improved quality of life, while also protecting fundamental civil liberties and humanitarian rights. This I think is the fundamental challenge, where the United States does not have yet a coherent, viable alternative. And do you think Bitcoin is that answer?
I do. Here's what's going to happen. So here's what's going to happen. Basically, there was Bitcoin. Then there were these things called stable coins, which were decentralized. There was Bitcoin, and then people realized Bitcoin's really volatile, right? Volatility is just how much something moves in one day, or the price movement of an asset. And so people said, well, I can't buy anything with Bitcoin because it's too volatile. So then these things called stable coins were created. Stable coins are basically cryptocurrencies, decentralized currencies that were pegged to an asset to keep their price, the volatility at like zero. Then what happened is people like JP Morgan came out with their own cryptocurrency, the JPM coin. But let's just remind everyone that it's not a cryptocurrency. It's just a centralized, it's a token tied to a database, which is not on a blockchain at all. It's just a centralized traditional database. And then Facebook comes out with Libra, builds the Libra Association. And now what's happening is all of these CBDCs, central bank digital currencies, are being built. And what they're going to do is incentivize people to use these central bank digital currencies. So you want to send money, I want to send you money after this, or I want to send my friend in Hungary money, right? I could use the traditional ACH system, which is automated clearinghouse system, which has been around it's created in the early 70s. It's like it's the payment rails for all of America. It settles about $40 trillion of transactions happen on ACH every single year. What they're going to do is say, if I want to send to my friend in Hungary, it'll cost me $30. If I want to send using this new central bank digital currency, it costs me $0, right? If I want to keep my money with JP Morgan, if I convert my dollars into JPM coin, they're going to give me an interest rate of 8%, not 2%, right? So they start incentivizing you, and they start pulling you into their system in the same way that they're pushing people out of cash, they pull you into their central bank digital currencies. What happens there is you're trapped. You're stuck in it. So they start to surveil everything. They start to see every transaction, and they start to, and again, this is fine in places where the government is not an authoritarian government, but what about all the other countries? What about the countries where if you're gay, you like get in a ton of trouble? Why wouldn't they also shut down your bank account then if they were so, right? And that's a really, really scary world. And I think the only answer is opting out of that system. And the only way to opt out is by moving assets into decentralized systems like Bitcoin.
I think this is a really interesting use case. So we're both in the 10th district, which happens to have the largest LGBTQ population in the country, if not the world. And what you just suggested is, so there are 70 United Nations countries that right now criminalize homosexuality in one way or another, subject to capital punishment, life imprisonment, fines, jail time, etc. And still 12 countries that criminalize it by death, capital punishment. And so what you're suggesting, Jason, is that somehow the kind of civil rights vanguard for like the LGBT community, for example, is the internet of money, is Bitcoin. Can you just like kind of drill a little bit deeper and again explain like how does opting out of the centralized banking system of and opting into Bitcoin, how does that then free just kind of bridging that in a concrete way for what that means for civil rights in this case?
Yeah, it doesn't allow you, I think it's important to understand, like, it doesn't allow you to do anything differently, except, I mean, you can send large amounts of money without like a big fee. What it allows you to do is protect yourself. And that's the important thing to understand. So
protect yourself how? Yeah, just kind of.
Yeah, so Bitcoin is a decentralized system, right? So what that means is that there's no, let's zoom out, right? So money is basically a ledger, right? There's a ledger that when I give my money to JP Morgan or I give my money to Bank of America, and then they give me credit, and then I can spend that credit at Lululemon or like whatever it may be, right? That's all just a ledger. Now the problem with that ledger is that it's centralized. Now the problem with that, there's many problems with that. One of them, which we've been talking about, is it's very like you can get into a dangerous rabbit hole when you start talking about like authoritarian governments, things like that. The other thing is it allows the government to print as much money as they need, right? And so this is kind of getting away from your question, but I'll go down a little bit and then come back up, is if we look at what just happened with coronavirus, right? What happened is we pumped because there's a centralized ledger, all we had to do, the guy who runs the Fed, Jay Powell, just had to change the buttons, and he added a few extra zeros, and he said, cool, now our monetary supply is not $2 trillion, it's $7 trillion, right? One of the reasons that this is ludicrous, right? The Fed's balance sheet has just completely exploded in terms of how much money is in the monetary system. One of the reasons they're doing this is that when the US goes to weaken the dollar, this means that it takes more dollars to buy the same amount of equities, commodities, things like that. Almost every asset price should rise, was their thought. And so they did, and the asset prices rose. But because there's more money in the system, right? The problem is this impacts the folks who actually hold those assets, the people who own stocks, the people who own bonds, the people who own real estate and private equity. You know who doesn't benefit? People who are not affluent and who don't own stocks and who don't own bonds, right? Because their financial assets aren't getting inflated. The things that get inflated are the stock market. But the dangerous outcome that I think we could see here is we see the failure of the fiat currency experiment. And just bear with me for a second, because that's kind of a bold thing to throw out there. It's important to remember that we're only 49 years into the experiment of fiat currency. There's no, in 1971, Richard Nixon took us off the gold standard, right? So that, then the US dollar is not based on anything. It's based on trust. When you pump so much money into the economy, you lose trust. So then if there's no trust, what's the US dollar based on, right? So I don't know, that went quite down the rabbit hole, but.
No. There's so much here, and I'll just offer my attempt to kind of ground it as well.
Yeah.
And just to kind of answer that question, I mean, it seems it's like Weber's theory of the state, which is it's backed by the threat of violence, right? I mean, and we see this in the militarization of our local police now, which is so what Jason has been referring to is like money and currency as a store of value, right? And so to me, one of the most painful examples is, again, this is the 10th district, one of the most Jewish districts in the country, includes communities in South Brooklyn, in Borough Park, that have been on the front lines of a rise in anti-Semitism against visibly Jewish Hasidic people in that community. And if you look in 1928 in Germany, in the wake of the Great Depression, what you find is a one-to-one correlation in the rise in unemployment and Nazi seats in the Reichstag. So Theodor Wolff at the time said, one can never imagine a democracy as diverse as Germany reigning in dictatorship. But it turns out that democracy itself brought in dictatorship in Germany in the wake of the Great Depression. And in Germany at the time, you saw hyperinflation, devaluation of the mark, where people were actually using the mark as kindling, right, to light their stovetops and cook their meals. Because just like any asset, any store of value, as we increase the supply of money, right, we have more of something, then the price of it will drop. The value of it, what it can get you, how much further that can get you. And what we've seen over the past number of decades is this hyper consolidation of market power, combined with automation, combined with globalization, and combined with what Jason just mentioned, which was the separation from this fundamental backing of the US dollar by the gold standard. But to me, the reason that people should care about this, or at least the American Jewish community, most concentrated here in the district, and people on the front lines of anti-Semitism, is that when institutions collapse, when there's a sense of economic and social insecurity and instability, historically, people have turned to find a scapegoat. And that singular scapegoat has tended to be the Jew. And so I think everyone has a vested interest in ensuring that stability, and that the actual value is not just artifice. It's not just hot air, which, to your point, most people, the vast majority of Americans, do not benefit when the stock market goes up. We've seen this fundamental separation, right? This decoupling, while as tens of millions are unemployed and we fail to provide any cash relief to them, and more than 10,000 have now been arrested in these riots, the stock market has gone up, but that hasn't been reflected in the quality of life or the value accrued to the vast majority of people.
Yeah, I mean, it's insane. The market right now makes no sense, right? Corporate earnings are estimated to be down something like 70%, and the S&P is down about 1%, right? 2%. And that's proof that there's so much extra money sloshing around the system, right? That the NASDAQ is about to hit all-time highs. We're in a global health pandemic where a bunch of people are unemployed and there are riots all over America. It makes completely no sense. And I think, just to touch on what you were saying earlier about like devaluation of the dollar and stuff like that, it's just really, really important to understand that like we haven't been doing this whole US dollar thing for that long, less than 50 years. And the fiat currency, what we're doing, it's really an experiment, right? And that experiment is most vulnerable to failure when an economy gets addicted to monetary stimulus. And that what stimulus is it's really just the long-term devaluation of a currency. But you can't devalue a currency forever, right? And the US economy is a stimulus addict today. So when you look back, like we've been on this experiment for 49 years, the world operated on sound money for thousands of years, right? We've only operated on fiat currencies for about 50 years. Fiat currency inherently and fundamentally drives an addiction to monetary stimulus, which is the devaluation of a currency. And we've seen how that ends throughout history. You were talking about in the 20s, with the German mark and in the early 30s. And like the US has been the leader of a free world for a long time, but that doesn't make us immune to mistakes or missteps, right? We've seen that other countries who weaken their currency to the point of hyperinflation, like Zimbabwe and Venezuela, like that's a real thing that happens. And bringing this entire thing full circle to Bitcoin, there are so many things that are interesting about Bitcoin: the uncensorability, the unseizability, the ability to control your own money. These are really, in my mind, all just perks. These are value adds. These are little benefits. The dominant force that will make Bitcoin really, really, really important to our future is the monetary policy. And by that, I just mean the fact that nobody can print. There will only ever be 21 million Bitcoin. There's no manager of Bitcoin. There's no head of the central bank of Bitcoin that can say, oh, shoot, we're in debt. We need some more Bitcoin. Let me go print it. It's a systematic algorithmic thing.
So if you could wave your magic wand, Jason, you've laid out a pretty existential case. What would this magic wand be?
Tell me more about this. So is this a magic wand for where I think other people should move their money, or where I think?
No, I mean, you have the reins. You have the reins, let's say, of the U.S. federal government in your hands. What could and should it do to help avert what you see as this imminent disaster?
I mean, we don't have you in the U.S. government yet, so like they're not going to do much. And the reason I say that is because people in power want to stay in power. You give the government an opportunity to surveil its people, they're going to continue to surveil. No one, not just governments, not just CEOs, anybody, when given the opportunity to get more power, it's very hard to turn down more power. So if I woke up tomorrow, I was head of the US government, I would push people into a central bank digital currency so that the government could get more power. Thankfully, I'm not the president right now. And so I have the opportunity, just like you have the opportunity when you hopefully get elected for this new position, to reimagine things from the ground up. And so if I had this magic wand, what I would do is really, really, really do everything in my power to encourage people to move a tiny, tiny, minuscule amount of their wealth into Bitcoin, 1%, right? Because what that does, it shows you that there's a different way, right? It shows you that there's a different way. And I think that's one of the things that everything that's happening right now in America, frameworks are being broken, trust is being broken. And although everything that's going on right now sucks, it's kind of an exciting time because we get to replace broken frameworks with entirely new frameworks that young people like ourselves are creating from the ground up.
Now, I think one thing you've been outspoken about is, in the context of, I think it's only 1 in 7 Americans who hold some form of cryptocurrency at this point, is the importance of representative or sort of diverse inclusion in what can be seen as a sort of tech bro, dominated space. So I know you've kind of commented on this kind of recently in particular, but how do you bridge and help make that case if that is the kind of prescription? How do we expand inclusion, access, and perhaps that's what Blockworks Group is exactly doing to Bitcoin and to crypto generally?
It's a tough question. 77% of venture-backed founders are white, right? And 90% of venture-backed founders are men. And that's in the tech world. So what happened is you had finance, you had Wall Street, which was all white. And then you get these people who are software engineers and crazy enough to go launch their own tech companies. And what happens is they go to the people with money, they go to Wall Street, they go to the VCs, and the white VCs, the white people with money, end up giving the white software engineers money. So you create another industry, the tech industry, that was all white. And what's happening right now in crypto and in blockchain and digital assets is the exact same thing. And so I think whether you're in crypto, whether you're in tech, whether you're in finance, whether you're not employed right now, whether you're in government, it's just important to understand that the system really easily recreates itself if you don't do something drastic. So all that really means, so for myself, let's talk personally. At Blockworks Group, we have a very big reach. We reach about 2 million listeners a month through our podcasts. You look at the podcasts, who have we had on as guests? They're primarily white males, right? And that's a lack of understanding on my behalf to actually think through that. So you start putting more people of color, more women on these podcasts, get their voice out. You hire, right? Myself as one of the founders, I've got hiring authority. So when you think about hiring, you hire people of color, you hire women, right? And so that then applies to anybody, whether you're a founder, whether you're unemployed right now. It's little actions every day that become habitual. It's not posting the black square on Instagram was great, but that's not going to do much change, right?
So I think one thing in the context of this campaign, it has been an exception of mine for a number of years now, is the importance and potential of structural change, like a universal basic income, to help flip that script foundationally. And if you look at Black households' net worth in the United States, for example, it's 1/10 that of white households, and this is pre-COVID. And non-white people are going to make a majority of the country by 2043, but median Black net worth is expected to be 0 by 2053. And this is so directly tied to your point around the fact that I think more than 2/3 of Americans don't even partake or get any value from the equities market, from the stock market. What having continuous streams of passive income, of a universal basic income for all people equitably, creates this new foundation, this new floor upon which you can build, right? Whether you're trying to start an enterprise, trying to start a business, whether you're moving for a new opportunity or you need to reskill or retrade or what have you, it creates this new floor upon which you can build. So I'm curious what your thoughts are on a universal basic income in particular as a way forward. I know many in the crypto Bitcoin world have been excited about ideas like it.
I think it's important to recognize that we're already there. We're already it's Andrew Yang had this innovative idea of UBI, right? He talks about it and the media tears him down. Wall Street tears him down. Tech tears him down, right? Now, what are we doing right now? Are we not doing UBI? Are we not sending checks to nearly every American right now? So I think it's important to understand that people think of UBI as this crazy, crazy, crazy concept that some guy who like came onto the scene and like introduced Andrew Yang, and like then like Andrew Yang goes away, and then but like UBI doesn't go away. UBI is more prevalent than ever before, I would say. We're doing UBI for the first time ever nearly. I like the idea. I think it's a great idea. I think that I don't know. I want to caveat that and just say I haven't done too much research on it, but at a very high level, looking at what's happening right now, how can you not, when you understand that that the government has enough money to give to the people by printing more money, how can you not want to give money to individuals who are living paycheck to paycheck right now?
I think one interesting kind of framing of this that's been offered by people like Glenn Weil, who's partnered with Vitalik, the founder of Ethereum, is it's actually not a matter of even giving money. It's that we're actually all laboring. We're actually all working for Facebook, for Google, for Amazon, for Netflix, for Uber. And to your point, that data that's being tracked in the context of surveillance is not just being mined and sold and resold, but that's actually labor. That's where trillions of dollars of value is coming from. And so it's actually a return on uncompensated work as a result of data being the food for algorithms in the AI and in the machine learning that's churning all this value for firms. So even outside of the extremely cataclysmic events, right, in the context of surveillance, right, you look at the Cambridge Analytica scandal, and it illustrates, in 2016, I was one of the 60 million or so people who got that push notification on Facebook, right? And this is how we interact with our data to date, which is we get a notification that says, oh, sorry, you're one of the hundreds of millions of target customers whose credit card number has been hacked. Or you're one of the 60 million whose Facebook data was stolen in Cambridge Analytica. And this has implications in psychographic micro-targeting and elections and who people, even vote into office. But even outside of that, of these sort of cataclysmic market power surveillance events, it's a fundamental sort of data dignity where you're producing this value. You're like, when you're going on a website and you have to fill out a CAPTCHA, right? You have to tell it the string of letters or words or images to help decipher it. What you're doing is actually uncompensated labor by training the machine to help decipher, well, this is a tricycle and this is a motorcycle. This is a car, this is a bus. We're actually all inputs into that system that's generating trillions of dollars in value.
I hadn't thought about it like that, but I guess it's, if you don't know who's if you don't know, what's the saying? When you're using a product, if you don't know who's like the end user, you are, I don't know.
You are the product.
You are the product. Yeah, exactly. I'm curious. I don't know if you are open to getting into it right now, but if I could ask you a question.
Please, yes.
Something that's going on that's really interesting right now that I'm trying to think through is censorship on social media. And this week, Snapchat took down Donald Trump's account. Twitter also put its mark of fact-checking on Donald Trump's tweets, on some of them. But Facebook hasn't done anything. And I think it's very popular on social media to say, at least, kind of left-leaning liberal social media, that like, oh my God, Facebook is terrible. Why aren't they doing anything about Trump? Not really understanding that, like, as soon as someone like Facebook gets involved, it's a organization where 90% of the employees lean left. So who are we to say that this liberal organization of Facebook should be able to put its stamp on Trump? I don't know. I'm thinking through these things. I don't know if you have any thoughts on censorship or anything like that, or if you even want to get into it. But
yeah, I think this is very, very deeply related to everything, all the themes we've been talking about. And I think to kind of zoom back a little bit, when Section 230, which is the part of the original regulation, kind of legislation that let platforms like Facebook be shielded from liability for the content that's posted on them. This was at the sort of outset, at the vanguard of the internet and the kind of .com creation. It was this kind of test trial, this hypothesis. I mean, it's all been this one large experiment of what happens if firms self-regulate, and are basically protected from any liability, right? So if there's hate speech, however you may define it, or there's white nationalist content or something that incites to violence, they're just a platform. They're just a conduit for individuals, entities, and so on to engage with. There's been a point in the evolution of common carriers and transportation, in public utilities, in cable networks and broadcast networks, in electricity. There's been a point where something transitions to become so fundamental, so ubiquitous, as to have to cross over into the realm of a public utility, of a common good, where the only entity that can meaningfully, at scale, and has the mandate and the capacity to do anything about it, theoretically optimizing for social welfare, is the federal government. And I think what we're seeing now is essentially 2 decades plus of an experiment with we don't really understand this whole code thing. And just this unfettered Wild West kind of run amok. So I don't think it should be up to the algorithm alone. I don't think it should be up to the folks hired by the firm alone, which you're seeing as an increasing line item for a firm like Facebook. I think we've reached a point, we've kind of hit the precipice where we need to reform the regulation and put this in the public domain. Now, this is a challenging thing to say when public trust in federal institutions in particular are at historic lows, but I think it's the way forward.
Yeah, it's tricky. It's tricky. Who are the arbiters of what's true, right? Who appointed those arbiters to that position? Who fact checks the fact checkers? Right?
Well, this is so deeply intertwined, Jason, because theoretically, in our democratic republic, it's the people, right? It's the people who decide. Well, we have a constitutional.
No, but not right. Not right now. Nobody elected Zuckerberg,
exactly,
CEO of Facebook, right?
Right.
So, and then Zuckerberg hired someone who hired someone who hired someone who. Then there's a 26-year-old white male who's deciding, who's from San Francisco and super liberal, who's deciding what is truth and what is not truth, right?
Right. Exactly. And so that's why trying to extricate those types of decisions from the hands of firms, I think, is the only viable path forward. And we did the same thing with cable news and broadcast networks, where we have federal regulation on, for instance, political advertising, on what can go on air and restrictions around it. But I think this also, we've seen this in the privatization of a lot of public space. So the use of algorithms in predictive policing, for example, where we now have machine learning making biased risk assessments to determine pretrial bail, to determine even sentencing requirements. So to your point about not lending to those who are risky, and this becoming this vicious cycle, right? Where if you don't have capital, you can't get capital. If you don't have cash, you can't get cash. If you haven't, and keeping you in that rut, that's actually now increasingly even being applied to the criminal justice system, where firms have been providing the algorithms that are being used to decide sentencing proceedings on the basis of risk-adjusted factors for how likely you are to recidivate, to commit another crime. And I mean, this is slightly, kind of off topic, but these end up being these black box machine learning algorithms. But I think the way this ties potentially deeply to cryptocurrency and decentralized governance is through the role of open source, where if you have no idea how the input, right? The input being, let's say, your demographics, your age, race, sex, zip code, etc., how that's then being input to decide what loan you're going to get, or what your interest rate is going to be, or what bail is going to be set at, or what your sentence will be, then there's no sense of any procedural accountability at all. So I think this is maybe where decentralized governance and open source solutions, perhaps built on top of systems like Ethereum, might help. But I'm not sure what your thoughts are on open source and decentralized solutions through blockchain and crypto are.
Couldn't be more on your page. I really strongly believe that it shouldn't be tech companies that get into fact checking, but rather it should be free open source technology. It doesn't need to be on a blockchain. It doesn't need to be a cryptocurrency related thing. It just needs to be open source technology that's free, universally available code and data for epistemology. You take a piece of text, you parse through it, you extract the assertions, and you compare it to explicitly specified knowledge graphs and oracles that pull from a bunch of different data sources. Better than we can in real time, right? And I think that's I think you complement that decentralized fact checking with citizen journalism, but I think that's I think free open source technology to do this is the answer.
So I'm kind of curious, Jason, it sounds like we're just totally side skirting this behemoth of institutions that we have that theoretically do the things we're talking about, right? Like the Federal Reserve, or the media, or our public health infrastructure. So I'm how do you reconcile with, I mean, you and Balaji and maybe a handful of others, right? Kind of being at the forefront of independent kind of citizen journalism in the context of COVID, ahead of, I mean, we're talking multi-trillion-dollar nation states, right? Whose mandate, whose entire modus operandi is protecting the public health, protecting the public interests. How do you even think about that state of being?
Thinking about that state of being, I don't know. I just try to, similar to you, I'm sure, talk to smart people and think through it. But I think you have to have a guiding light, right? And you have to have a guiding principle. And there are institutions. There's the Federal Reserve. There's the media. There's the healthcare system. That's great. They've all gone against what is my personal guiding light, which
Which
is
is
freedom. And innovation, I think, going back to this stateless innovation, innovation is bottoms up, and it's going to come from these entrepreneurs and technologists who figure out how to maximize freedom. And freedom refers to freedom to ideate, to experiment, to iterate on ideas, and to generally create or increase the surface area of serendipity to create inventions while working on these hard problems. And so, like, I think when you have a guiding principle like that, it dictates like how you think about Facebook and censorship and things like that. How you think about the media, how you think about what's going on with these protests and the policing system. And you start to, off of this like core belief, build ideas that try to fix all of these institutions, because they're all broken in some way or another. And they'll always be broken. But broken just means there's something to fix and improve, right? So just like they're broken now, but they're improved upon what they were 50 years ago. Those systems 50 years ago were broken, but they're also an improvement upon what it was 50 years ago. Our systems and our institutions 50 years from now are going to be broken, but they're going to be better than what we have now.
Can you just kind of explain or help ground again, like what you mean by Bitcoin is free speech money? Like, what does that really mean? How does this help you get to your North Star of freedom?
Bitcoin is the only way in the world right now that you can still stay in the digital economy while keeping control of your actions. And so what I mean by that is, whenever I send any money through the current financial system, it's being tracked. And that's not really a problem until you live somewhere where there's a government that wants to limit your freedom, right? Going back to that North Star of freedom. When you want to, and there are so many countries out there that are limiting freedom of speech, what's going to happen is they're going to limit freedom of money. Same exact thing. And Bitcoin is a way to opt out of that system and keep your freedom of money. It's non-censorable, it's non-seizable. The government can't take it. The government can't shut it down. The government can't see where you're spending it, can't see who you're sending it to, can't see who's sending it to you, can't see how you're making it. That's a system where there's freedom.
Just kind of trying to pull in some of the questions that have been coming in as well. Someone just said
Bitcoin is being tracked unless you're purchasing it OTC or it's being mined. So what they're referring to, there are tools out there that can track it. It's important to remember it's a public system, right? So if I knew your wallet address, I could go to blockchain.com or any other blockchain explorer and see like how much Bitcoin you hold, things like that. There are tools like Elliptic and Chainalysis that can tell you a lot about what's happening on chain, with on-chain data, on-chain addresses, money being sent and stuff like that. When you buy Bitcoin, a lot of people buy Bitcoin through exchanges, and then they hold it somewhere like Coinbase, right? We've basically recreated the financial system, right? Just in crypto. And it's good, right? Because it allows more people to come into the crypto space. But buying and keeping your crypto with Coinbase is no different than keeping your assets with JP Morgan. It's important to remember that. So this person, I actually don't see their name, but they said Bitcoin is being tracked. Yeah, Bitcoin's being tracked if you keep it in the traditional financial system a la Coinbase, right? You can take your Bitcoin off and out of that system and into something like use Ledger or Trezor or things to take your money in custody and hold your own money. I'm not saying that you should do that with 100% of your assets. That'd be crazy. But it's just important to remember to have some in reserves, because what happens if the government shuts down my bank account because I go to a protest tonight, right? that would suck because I'd lose access to all of my finances. But so what I want to do is hold some of my assets in Bitcoin so that can actually control that when something like that does get out of hand.
And to a skeptic, perhaps, is your line of reasoning there, at least in the American context, that, well, hey, look at New York. You have, as you kind of laid out at the outset, you have a restriction on, your 8 p.m. curfew and your kind of freedom of movement around the city. Is that your sort of slippery slope towards, well, therefore your finances will be curtailed too? Like, how do you kind of draw those connections, connect the dots for someone just kind of out there who may not see, well, the United States closing or kind of restricting access to your own capital?
There are no dots to connect. So let's go back a few months. January. When did Kobe Bryant die? January, February, right?
Recently, yeah.
Early Q1. Remember when we were talking about Kobe Bryant and the helicopter crash, and there was no COVID, and there was no unemployment, and the stock market was at all-time highs, actually still at all-time highs, but there was no quantitative easing happening. Everything was working just fine. 3 months later, everything, the entire world flipped upside down. Everything, all the institutions we talk about, the financial system, our health system, everything's flipped upside down. Things happen like that. So this isn't something where I'm like, oh yeah, look at point A, which leads to point B, which leads to point C. Clearly we get to point D. There's jump risk, right? Where there's black swans, right? Where you just go like this, you look up, you look around one day, and I can't leave after this podcast, I can't leave my apartment. It's 8:20. I can't leave my apartment. I can't take a Lyft. I can't take an Uber. I can't take a city bike, right? What happened to my freedom? I don't know. I woke up one day and it was gone.
We started out in Hungary, and I think this is a really, really fascinating framing because there's been much ado about the rise of right-wing populism, of the likes of Orban, and really the far left and the far right, right? From Corbyn to Orban, and the kind of response has been, to your point about Ridley's comparison between political structure and regulatory structure. The response has largely been, well, these systems are out of whack, and these are sort of anomalous cases, or perhaps outgrowths of some sort of resentment that has grown or kind of festered. Do you have kind of a theory of the case as someone so hyper focused and steadfast in commitment to freedom as this North, kind of guiding star? Do you kind of have a way you wrap your mind around the populism of the moment?
I love it. Is what I think about it. I think people are trying to take back power in every aspect of life right now, and they're trying to take back power and vote, and they're voting with their wallets, right? They're moving their assets. Bitcoin's never been stronger. The network's never been stronger. They're moving money from the traditional system into Bitcoin. Look outside our windows right now. There's a protest going on. It's literally like you and my windows right now. There's a protest going on, right? People are angry at the system, and for good reason, right? And so the way I think about what's going on right now, I love it. I think it's frustrating, and you get angry when you think about it, but at the same time, it's about time, is what I'd say.
Any other thoughts, topics, questions you wanted to raise? You think we have to hit?
No, not really. I would just say, just understand that there's this thing called jump risk, right? Where You can't think it through, but one day you wake up and you say to yourself, what just happened? And we just experienced jump risk, right? It's gonna happen again. And anytime you just don't be afraid to have a hedge. Don't be afraid to have a hedge when it comes to your investments. Don't be afraid to have a hedge when it comes to politics, right? And what I would say is, in less than a decade, there's a decentralized currency that went from the fringes of the internet to being discussed by the best governments, the best companies, and the brightest minds in the world. 10 years, 11 years, 2009 to 2020, 11 years. Meanwhile, the federal balance sheet has gone from 1985, every 5 years is like 200 billion, 300 billion, 400 billion, 600 billion, 800 billion, 2 trillion, 4 trillion, 10 trillion, right? So when you see that, you start to see things like what's happening on the streets, it should make you a little bit concerned. And so I would just say, like, just hedge and just be aware that there are other options.
One other thing I think,
wrote Jonathan Herzog 2020 in 16 days or 18 days.
Well, we'll get to that in a second. I so appreciate it very much because, yes, voting is critical. But one thing I want to try to, on kind of a meta level, is, or just maybe like another layer to your thinking in that context is, for me, and I'll just kind of illustrate by example, I can point to, for example, parents being immigrants from Israel, and growing up in an environment and having the constant sense of precarity and what the possibilities are. Where if you live in Israel or have ever been to Israel, you'll know in every single apartment, every single unit, wherever you go, there's a bomb shelter, and it's just baked into the price of living, right? The price of being. If you go to a playground, you'll see there's like playground infrastructure that's actually like a missile defense. It kind of doubles as missile defense. There's a national 15-second siren system where everyone in the entire country, in the entire society, knows that when you hear this siren, you have 15 seconds to run into the nearest shelter, whether you're at the mall or out in the streets, or at home or in the park. And I think just on a personal level, I mean, I guess, we've talked about your kind of family journey and this kind of moment of insight perhaps in Hungary, but what is it you think in your experience or your perspective that gives you that kind of really deep, visceral understanding of the precarity of this moment, and of our liberal democracy as we know it?
There's nothing that's different about me in the same way that there's not from me to you to someone who's watching this on YouTube to Facebook to LinkedIn. I just think it comes down to two things, which is maybe three things, which is form an opinion on things, have an opinion. You're not going to be right all the time, but have an opinion. Have an opinion. Should Facebook censor Donald Trump? Form an opinion on that. Should the protests that are happening right now happen after 8 p.m. when there's curfew? Form an opinion on that, right? Just have an opinion. That's number one. Number two, put your opinion out into the world. Show up at the protests. If that's your opinion, if you think that's right, show up at the protests, put your beliefs out there, talk to your family, talk to your friends, put your beliefs out into the world, because you're going to learn. And because more importantly, if you don't do it, no one else is going to do it, right? And then the third thing I'd say is be passionate about the ideas. Form opinions on things, put the opinions out into the world. The world's going to change your opinions on things because the world will give you feedback. Form those opinions even more, mold them, sculpt them, and then get passionate about them. And that's what I would say.
One final note, and then we'll close, is I think this exact kind of really entrepreneurial mentality is part of the goal of what I think federal policy can help support and help create. And we can actually help improve the conditions for more people to have their heads up, to have a sense of possibility, to be able to ideate and test those hypotheses, be able to take those risks. Right now in American life, the cost of failure is so high. It's astronomically high. You have more than 1.6 trillion in student debt, for example, and more than 40% of college graduates underemployed. And that's only in a country where only a third of all people even have a college degree in the first place. And the risk of failure is so astronomical because people have no reserves. They have little to no savings. In an economy where 2/3 of GDP is driven by consumption, that we've baked in precarity and instability into the very fiber of being and of existence. And I think, to me, there's just countless examples of the fact that it doesn't have to be this way. I mean, if you just look at the response to COVID and you look at Taiwan or South Korea or New Zealand or any number of countries that have implemented even basic contact tracing or testing at scale, and you just see very simply it doesn't have to be all this way. There are indeed alternatives. We just have to build them ourselves.
I agree with you. I completely do.
Well, Jason Yanowitz, so appreciate it. Thank you so much for coming on. I want to give you a chance to plug anything if you'd like to. I think it's blockworksgroup.io. Is that right?
It is. Yeah, our website is blockworksgroup.io. I'm at Twitter at Jason Yanowitz. But what I'd plug is voting. If you're in New York, get out and vote. If you're anywhere else watching this, get out and vote. There are elections coming up. I think Jonathan put a link there, but yeah, you can go to NYC, if you're in New York, nycabsentee.com to get an absentee ballot, which really anyone can get if you're kind of worried about getting coronavirus. Yeah, I mean, I think, Jonathan, you're running for a great cause. You're worried about the climate. You're worried about LGBTQ equality. You're worried about and talking about criminal justice reform. You are talking about crypto and how things like open source technology can be applied to censorship and social media. You're talking about things like universal healthcare. And so I would just say, find people who you're passionate about and vote for them when the time comes, which is very soon.
nycabsentee.com/absentee. Fucking get out there and vote. Your vote counts so much that your elected officials spent months trying to cancel the primary. We spent weeks, Jason, in federal court, in the Southern District, and in the Second Circuit, defending your right to vote. So get out there. If 15,000, just 2% of all people in the 10th District, Wall Street, the world's financial capital, the west side of Manhattan, and South Brooklyn, get out and vote for this vision, we can get it done.
I love it.
Appreciate
Thanks for having
you.
me on, Jonathan. I
Thank
appreciate
you.
it.
Take care.
Thanks
Stay
everyone
safe.
for watching. Bye.